right. Well, welcome back to Diverse Joy, a podcast that infuses science, practical skills, and most of all, joy into discussions around diversity. My co-host is the adventurous Dr. William Cox.
And my co-host is the effervescent and riveting Dr. Amber Nelson.
Awesome. And we are dressed up as Chippendale Rescue Rangers today for this March episode. For those of you, last season, we talked about March being Disneybounding month.
Yeah.
And so we are Disneybounding, which is like dressing up inspired by these characters, like a version of cosplay, but a little bit more like regular everyday clothing. So today we are bounding as Chippendale as our,
Rescue Rangers
for today in honor of Disneybounding month.
Also, just a little behind the scenes tidbit for our listeners. The Diverse Joy theme song, which you hear a little bit at the beginning of every episode and on the breaks and at the end, music by Jay Arner. When we were giving Jay the kind of general vibe we were going for, it was basically like, we were like, kind of like the Chippendale Rescue Rangers theme song. Chippendale. Like,
Rescue Rangers.
Diverse Joy.
Yeah.
And, of course, Jay is the musical artist, and we were like, this is just inspiration. We trust your craft, but, something upbeat and joyful. I love our theme song. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you, Jay Arner.
Woo woo. So as we start.
Yeah. So Amber, what's bringing you joy?
Yeah. So obviously March being Disneybounding month is always a joy for me. But also in March, with my nonprofit, my For Us By Us Kinship Coalition, during spring break, we take our youth on an HBCU trip. So a trip touring different historically Black colleges and universities. And this last year, I'll talk about that one since we haven't gone yet this year. But we got to take our group to Atlanta, and we spent a week there. And we went to 3 HBCUs in 1 state school. And I just cannot talk about that enough. I mean, I could talk all day about it. I won't. I'll spare you all. But it was just the most incredible experience, and really looking forward to taking them again this year. But it is, as I've said before, my nonprofit is really specifically working with Black youth in rural Oregon. And we took our youth as well as some other youth from Portland, Black youth from Portland, and took them to Atlanta and the HBCUs. And it was incredible. Last episode, I talked about what Baltimore meant to me, right? Being able to be in a space for the first time that like reflected back to me. Yeah. And I was 30, I was in my 30s when I had that first experience, and being able to take these high schoolers and bring them into that environment and see that experience and watch them go to these institutions where they didn't think that they could be, or that they felt like they would belong, and see themselves reflected back to them, and just the incredible experience it was for them, obviously, but I took so much from being there with them and experiencing it with them. And so I'm really, really looking forward to doing it again this year. And I just can't wait to continue to expand those experiences and do that again. So
yeah, I'm curious. So in the last episode where we had our wonderful guest, Bernie, you talked about kind of some hesitation you had when thinking about going to an HBCU, because it kind of wasn't the type of environment you were used to. And these are Black kids also in Oregon. Yeah. So have you seen or thought about some of them having similar kinds of hesitation?
100%.
How have you?
I think a lot of them did have some of that hesitation of like, I don't know if I wouldn't fit here. And a lot of them left going like, oh my gosh, I want to apply. I want to come here.
Aww.
And that was just so cool. And again, like my own, like healing my own inner child, right? Was like also being there and like, oh man, I wish I could come back. I wish I could go back and go to an HBCU and be in this space too. So it was really, again, kind of living vicariously through them a little bit, but really being able to see that shift and change, like, oh yes, I do belong here and there is space for me here and I would love to be in a space like this.
Aww.
So yes, I think that there was some hesitation, but it drastically shifted once.
Well, and you
once
know,
we visited.
those kids in you, they had what you didn't have. Like
Exactly.
if you had an Auntie Amber to like help you kind of see, oh, I could fit there, you know, you might have gone a different path.
Right. And again, it's one thing to hear it, right? Because I think my mom said that it's not like I never heard it before, but being able to go, to experience, to be in this space was really life-giving, and I think it was incredibly meaningful for my youth. And so again, I can't wait to take them back and explore some new institutions and spaces. So yeah, it's incredible.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Cool. Thanks. Yeah. How about you? What's your joy?
Yeah, so for my joy this month, it's cosplay. Just kind of in general. You know, I don't do bounding month as hardcore as you do, which I encourage everyone follow.
A lot of people don't.
Follow our socials. Follow at Diverse Joy on Instagram, especially because last year we posted kind of a slideshow of all or almost all the bounding outfits. There's a lot.
There are a lot.
So you can see all Amber's fun stuff. But yeah, cosplay in general. So I go to various Comic-Con and convention type things and love dressing up. Do many different kinds of costumes, and thankfully have a wonderful partner in our producer Roman who makes a lot of stuff for me. Like whenever
incredibly talented, by the way.
Whenever I'm looking around and I can't like on the internet to like buy something and can't find quite exactly what I want, I kind of look over at him and like, so I try to give him enough of a lead time, but there have been a few times it's like the night before and I realize, oh, if I could just have this one thing, it would make everything perfect.
Just take it over the top.
Do you have time for this one thing? He loses some sleep doing it for me.
Listen, I can't even begin to tell you all how incredibly talented this man is. Their house is just ornate with all of these such detailed things that Eric Roman has created. So, and I've seen so many of the costumes and things that he's created for you. So it just takes it to another level for sure.
And actually, if you are into that kind of thing, you can follow his Instagram for cosplay. It's at Super Gay Cosplay. Gay Cosplay.
How did I not know this? I didn't know about this. Oh. Now I need to follow.
And we can put that in the notes of the episode. So, but anyway, cosplay in general, you know, there's something about just kind of dressing up as a character you really like,
100%.
kind of escaping yourself a little bit, but also finding yourself a little bit when you're seeing like, why is it this character that I like? Even if it's like a villain or something, there's something about the character that's resonating with you, and you can step into their shoes and maybe express a side of yourself that you're not normally comfortable with or don't realize that you want to express. It's always good to get compliments too. Not that I do it for the compliments, but like when other people are like, oh, they recognize maybe an obscure character you're dressing up as, and you're like, oh, there are other people who are nerdy like me. And so that's a different kind of sense of community. We talk about community a lot on this podcast, but usually it's related to kind of race or orientation or some kind of like other kind of identity. But I think the cosplay community is also, it's a different kind of community, but it's a place where you can find people with similar interests, similar connections, and it'd be a lot of fun.
And there's research, and it's actually an area of research that I've wanted to get into around the self-expression through cosplay. And because you see, I mean, I won't get it off too far on this, but it excites me, right? Because you see a group, and especially going to Comic-Cons and things like that, where we do have a group of people and some folks that aren't necessarily super expressive in their regular life. Some that really are and some that aren't, but that there's something about dressing up and becoming a character or allowing yourself to express in this different way. Like you said, like what part of this character, this personality is something that's inside you, but don't necessarily feel like I can normally express this. But when I'm in costume, I can embrace this part of me and this side of me, which is it is really beautiful and fun.
Yeah, so we'll get Roman to stick some of my cosplay pictures up. I've done Superman a few times. Ursula, the Sea Witch. I think I mentioned that in the Halloween episode. Ahsoka Tano from Star Wars. That's one of my big ones. I do a lot of gender swapped ones where it's like I'm a male version of a female character. And it's a lot of fun. Another thing, just tying it, not that our joys always have to tie to kind of our topics, but one of my favorite things is following Instagram accounts of people of color who do cosplay. There's a few that are about Black cosplayers or Black superheroes, and you see comments that they get a lot are like, well, Sailor Moon's not black. Or Ariel isn't black, although now she is. But
both the cartoon and the live
but
action.
Like you can still see, well, what would a black Sailor Moon look like? And it's always amazing.
Right.
And it's both drawing your attention to kind of biases people have. Like, also Sailor Moon is like a moon princess. So is the skin color the most important part? Right. And she's drawn kind of white, but she's actually a, Japanese anime. So should white girls be doing it either if it's a problem for a black girl?
What's the difference?
So it also brings up interesting things, but also that's part of the kind of broadening your input skill we often talk about. If you start seeing different and more diverse examples of Black expression, and it doesn't just have to be Black folks; it can be Asian folks, Native American folks, and so on. But you can see different kinds of expression. It broadens the input in your mind and kind of diversifies your mental image of what members of those groups can be like. Those are all good things for working against bias, which is skipping way ahead to the skill. But so cosplay is my joy. Always brings me joy. We've talked about my costume room, our costume room, excuse me.
Again, this costume room, y'all, is incredible. Incredible. Yes.
Yeah, it's overflowing. We might have too many.
It is very impressive. Again, it's very impressive. The first time I saw it, it's got like a TARDIS door from Doctor Who, and it truly is bigger on the inside. You go in, and it's just every time I go in there, I'm amazed. So yeah. Excellent. So cosplay, what a great joy to share with everybody. So today we are going to be talking about like implicit bias and the IAT, the implicit association test.
Correct.
So I'll let you take it away. Yeah. So I'm going to talk kind of like a lot of the scientific history behind the idea of implicit bias is kind of the most common term. Throughout this podcast and in my training, I usually use the term unintentional bias. Let's take a wayback machine back to the 80s. So actually my PhD advisor back when she was doing her dissertation in the 80s, kind of had this idea that related to kind of bias in the literature. And basically the core idea of kind of unintentional bias or implicit bias is that, we have our conscious values and intentions, which especially white folks, but everyone, but in white folks in particular might believe in equality, believe, that Black people should be respected and not seen as less than and all that stuff. But you'll sometimes see behaviors that don't match those intentions, that aren't in alignment. I like that wording. And so they'll have kind of, they'll do or say something biased, or they'll do something that doesn't treat a Black person equitably or equally related to a white person in a study. And so there's kind of this disconnect between what people are saying and what they're sometimes doing. And so Trish, my PhD advisor, as way back as a grad student, set up this one study that really kind of blew the doors open on what we now often call implicit bias. What happens in the study, it's using a machine that we used to use in cognitive research called a tachistoscope. Say that again.
Tachistoscope. Now I'm saying it wrong.
Tachistoscope?
Tachistoscope.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
But basically, it's this machine that's able to kind of flash an image at your face really quickly, and you're able to very precisely determine how quickly or how briefly an image is displayed. Okay. So like on a computer screen, which we would use more often now, there are after images. So if you want something to be displayed for only like 50 milliseconds, the way LED screens or computer screens work, they're often after images, which can cause problems. But back in the day, it was this tachistoscope. And this is what people in culture commonly call subliminal priming.
Okay.
So you're able to display images or even words, and it's able to activate ideas in people's minds without them being conscious of it.
Right. Okay.
So what she did in this study, she used this tachistoscope to subliminally activate ideas about Black people.
Okay.
So if you ask the people what they just saw, they're like, I didn't see anything, or I have no idea. For the most part, there were one or two people who were able to catch it, and then they don't get included in the study because it breaks the study. But basically, activating ideas about Black folks in people's minds without them having any conscious understanding of it. So just unconsciously, subliminally activating these ideas. So that's about half the people in the study, and then half the people don't get that activation to the same extent. And then what these folks do, they read this story. So a story about this guy named Donald. It's a very ambiguous story. And what's ambiguous about it is he engages in a few different actions that you could interpret as very aggressive or just normal, assertive. You could think they're not that aggressive. It's so a few different things in the story. You don't need all the details, but basically it's a story that we knew you could see the person is really aggressive or not so much. And then they asked people what they thought about this ambiguous character, Donald. If they'd had ideas about Black people activated subliminally, unconsciously, they saw his actions as more aggressive. That's one of the key stereotypes and things we know that people have about Black folks, especially thinking of them as aggressive, criminal, violent, those sorts of things. So when the social category Black is activated subconsciously in their minds, those stereotypes influence how they saw Donald, and they thought he was more aggressive. When they didn't have those below conscious, subliminal means kind of outside of awareness, in case I wasn't clear about that. When they have that stuff activated, they see him as more aggressive. When they don't, they were more often interpreted as less aggressive.
Interesting. Okay.
And so and then what else is important about that is this was true regardless of what their personal values said, their level of prejudice. So they had people who on other measures said, I believe in equality, I believe in integration. This was in the 80s, so that was still, at least in recent history, that Black and white people should be equal and should be treated well. And there were other people who were more haters that were higher in prejudice, who were like, I don't like Black people. I don't think the races should mix. So like awful, hateful kinds of things. Whether they were high in prejudice or low in prejudice, this effect stayed the same.
Interesting.
So we still saw the effect, even in people who believed in equality and had positive feelings towards Black folks. We still saw this effect where if Black ideas were activated subconsciously, it influenced their judgments.
So it's really interesting because I think I mentioned my dissertation last semester. Wow. Last season. But I had kind of a portion that wasn't intentionally that, but really activated something very similar. I had them do, they were trying to determine characteristics of scholarship worthiness for a number of applicants, and I gave them this test that really kind of primed them essentially around more biased thoughts around stereotypes for Black folks in particular. And we saw that, like, the thought was like, oh, if we bring it up, maybe they'll be more mindful of it, and it won't, then they'll be more conscientious of how they are evaluating the scholarship worthiness of these applicants. But what we found was exactly that. Even if they cared about it, like, it still showed up. It still showed up. Yeah.
Yeah. mean, and this is jumping ahead a bit, but this is what our skills section every episode and the whole bias habit training is about. It's not enough, like it's activating it, but then you really have to start tuning in, recognizing that it could be influeing your behavior.
Yep.
So yeah. And there are many studies like that out there. And so her original study and paper on this topic started the whole idea of what people now call implicit bias. There's a huge explosion in research in this area. And the key thing that I want to emphasize now, and then we're going to come back to, is this notion that, like, look, this is what's automatically activated when it's outside of awareness. It influences people regardless of their prejudice level. And that was back in the 80s.
Right.
So people started expanding on this idea in many different ways. And one of the ways that I think is famous or infamous now is a computer task called the implicit association test.
Oh, yes. Very familiar.
And I don't want to get into all the details. It's hard to describe without visuals for people who are just listening. But basically, this is a computer task where it flashes pictures and words on the screen. There are pictures of Black folks and pictures of white folks, and then words that are more positive or pleasant and words that are more negative or unpleasant.
Right.
And the task kind of gets you to kind of hold two categories in your mind at the same time. So say Black people and unpleasant words.
Right.
And you're supposed to categorize them with one key.
Right.
So if it's a Black person, I'm going to say left and right. If it's a Black person, you go to the left. If it's a bad word, you go to the left.
Right.
If it's a white person, you go to the right. If it's a pleasant word, you go to the right. And it's easier for people to hold white people and pleasant words together in their mind. The idea here is if subliminally, subconsciously, however you want to talk about it, unconsciously, you have more negative associations with Black people than with white people, when you're categorizing Black people and negative words together, it's just cognitively easier for you because they're already kind of related because of this unconscious stereotypes and habits of mind how I often talk about them.
And essentially, if I'm remembering right, it's been a long time since I did the IAT. But essentially because the association is stronger, you kind of do it quicker, right?
Exactly.
It's because your brain associates, it makes more sense in our brain. So when we're doing the task, we're going to make that association faster. So we're kind of responding quicker.
Yeah. Like imagine, this is an analogy I'm coming up with on the spot, but I think it's good. So imagine that you're sorting animals and you have to sort cows and horses on one side and cats and dogs on the other. Yeah. That's really easy because you already kind of associate cats with dogs. They're both house kind of pet animals, and horses and cows you both kind of associate with farms. Right. So if you're sorting them that way, it's quicker, easier. But if you have to sort cats and horses on the left and dogs and cows on the right, like imagine a bunch of animals coming at you and you have to go left, right. It's harder because it's like, oh wait, no, that's a dog.
A more thought.
Yeah, and so that's the kind of idea. Basically, if things are more associated already in your mind, it's easier to categorize them together. And this is true with this implicit association test, or IAT as it's called. And we're mostly going to focus on it with regard to race and specifically Black people because it's kind of the most commonly widely used one. But people have validated and used IATs related to all different kinds of biases and even things that aren't biases like animal categorization, like I was just describing.
And one other thing about the Black-white association, I think it's also particularly from a research standpoint, it's easier because they're the most obvious, like visually distinct. And so I think it's important as we're talking about diversity things, why oftentimes research or the conversation goes to Black-white differences. It's not because that's the most important thing, but especially when we're doing research, it is the most visually distinct. And so it's the easiest to study, right? And to look at it.
And even on this podcast, when we're talking about these things, I think we talk about that kind of bias more than any kind. It's not just because Amber's Black.
Right.
It's in part because we've been trained in these research literatures that have had that. Yeah. And like in the bias habit breaking training, which really is the foundation for a lot of this podcast, I really emphasize generalizing what you learn across different forms of bias. So when we talk about this type of bias, today's topic or any topic, the examples we use are just examples.
Right.
They're trying to teach you the kind of deeper skills or deeper principles.
Right.
And so I always want all of you listeners and viewers to think like, oh, how would this also play out for Asian stereotypes and disability related things and so on. And we definitely put a lot of intentional effort into trying to make sure we use those examples as well. We might not always succeed. Because sometimes the easiest thing to come to mind is going to be these examples that have been used most often in the literature. So I apologize if that's if it ever feels that way. But also send us your your examples. Like go to diversejoy.com. We have that submission link there. Like if you're like, oh, you never talk about Asian stereotypes. Send us your examples so that we can include them.
Absolutely.
All right. So a little bit of tangent.
That's okay.
So the IAT got invented. It's this computer task that's very easy to implement. Which that's a credit to the researchers who invented it, Greenwald and Banaji. They, made it available to everyone. The problem is, I think it's a little bit too easy. So the tachistoscope I was talking about earlier, you have to have this fancy equipment. Back then, you have to have training to really understand
it, let alone use it.
And so you really needed training in science to really understand what you're doing.
Right.
But the IAT, anyone can use it. And so a lot of researchers have used
BuzzFeed videos.
Yeah,
BuzzFeed ones that use the IAT principle.
And so then workplaces are like, oh, this shows that people have bias, so we're going to use it.
Right.
The problem is then it gets overused and sometimes people interpret it in ways that aren't scientifically justified. And so it gets a little bit out of control. And actually, let's talk about that a little now. I think I said we were going to do it later. But so it has a very kind of visceral reaction for a lot of people.
Sure.
Like as you're doing it, you can feel that it's easier to associate Black people with negative things. You can 100%. Feel it. And it's not just white people also, I should say.
Oh, for sure. Everybody.
The data shows that even Black folks, about 50%, it shows that they have a bias against Black folks.
Absolutely. Well, and we've talked about that before, right?
We're in a society where we learn these things.
We're all receiving the same messages, regardless of what our background is, what our skin color is. We're all receiving the same messages. And so we're internalizing those things, whether we are intending to or not. And, you're talking about that visceral reaction. I know that I've done that IAT several times. And once I kind of figured it out or recognized and felt that difference, I was like, oh, maybe I can manipulate it a little bit to make sure, right?
There are people who use it in diversity trainings. And I do not advise that. First, just to cut to the chase, I guess, because people have different reactions. There's some people who will take it and then they'll feel that, oh, I'm having bias. And they'll be like, gosh, I really need to learn from that. And I need to do something. There are other people who will have a reaction that's like, I am pissed off. Like, how dare you? How dare you imply that I'm racist? And they'll say, this task is just trying to trick us into being racist. And I can definitely empathize with that. I get it. And so and when I say people used to use this in diversity trainings, my colleagues and I did as well. In fact, one of the most celebrated research findings from our bias habit breaking training is that it was the only intervention that's ever been shown to create long-term changes on this measure.
On that measure
and it's because of all the skills that we teach people. We teach them if you start, broadening your input with different kinds of media, like we recommend at the end of every episode, that helps work against these biases. You can start practicing different ways of thinking, the kind of replacing stereotypes, which was an early on skill we talked about that we revisit from time to time. We teach people you can actively work against these things, and then they actually do. So that's why ours has been, I'm pretty sure I'm still accurate with this. I haven't seen any other examples. The only time that there's been shown a very long-term decrease in implicit bias. We showed that in our original study. And, like with any first study in a series, there were problems with that study. It was a little underpowered, meaning there weren't as many participants as we would like. But we've since replicated it with much, much larger, more robust sample sizes. But lots of people started using this both in very good research, also some maybe not as good research, not as careful, not as well thought out, and then also in the public realm, in the practitioner realm of just using it in these trainings. And it really has exploded. There are thousands of studies using this measure. But then that poses some problems itself. So a few years back, this is when I was still in grad school, so many years back now, I should say.
We won't talk about how many years.
About a decade ago. About a decade ago, there were some people that did some meta-analyses on the IAT. For those of you who don't know, a meta-analysis, what it does is it's a statistical way of taking many, many, many research studies, pulling them all together and saying statistically across these hundreds of studies, how strong is a given effect. And there were kind of these battling meta-analyses about the IAT. They were looking at how much it predicts behavior.
Interesting.
So we have this IAT measure. So it gives you kind of a numerical score. And then there were studies where people would engage in some kind of behavior.
Right.
And they would say, what's the correlation or the statistical relationship between this measure and these various behaviors? And the behaviors are far reaching, many different kinds of behaviors. Like there's some studies we and I say we because I've done some of these studies as well. They would, so in a race context, for those of you who can see us, we'll act out a little, but for those of you who are listening, Amber and I are sitting near each other. We would set up a study where there's a Black person sitting in a chair, and then our research participants, we asked them, oh, could you grab that chair over here and come sit by this person? And you'd measure how far apart the chairs were.
Interesting. Okay.
And this is one thing that actually tends to be related to the IAT. If they have more of this kind of unconscious bias or implicit bias on the IAT, they sit a little bit further away because it's a measure of kind of this kind of
comfort, discomfort.
Comfort. Exactly. So that's one kind of behavior. Other kinds of behaviors are like, who do they, pick for jobs? Like they have people sort resumes and say, how high they rank a Black person's resume when they're ranking everyone, things like that. How much money they give to Black causes. Lots of different kinds of behaviors that might be related to kind of race stuff. And what this initial meta-analysis showed was there's not a very good relationship between where the IAT as a single measure doesn't predict these kinds of behaviors very well.
Interesting. Okay.
There's a number of things with that. The level of quality of the studies widely varies. There's some that are really, really high quality, and there's some where people are like, oh, I'll just use this measure, and they aren't really... And I apologize, and I'm not calling out any specific. I have some specifics in mind, but I'm not going to call them out. But I think that they're sloppy studies, and so I would say the quality of the study says we shouldn't include it. Or we should take that into account. Then there was another meta-analysis was like, actually, it's pretty good at predicting behavior if you take out some of those studies, and so they were kind of combating in the literature. In the scientific literature, like, oh, we think the IT is great. We think the IT is bad. And it got a lot of media attention.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
it's so widely used. So it makes sense that it would catch the eye of the media.
And I don't think the media did anything wrong.
Right.
Well, I'm gonna say at least one thing that it did wrong. But in general, that's their job, and they were working with the best of what they had. But like one of the articles from a major newspaper said something along the lines of psychology's favorite tool to measure racism isn't any good, or something like that. And so many things wrong with that. One, is it a measure of racism? Well, not many people say that. We'll talk about implicit bias.
Right.
Racism, we wouldn't really use that word, and I think that makes it catchier to be in a headline. Isn't any good. Like, so this meta-analysis is showing it doesn't predict behavior very well. Like that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't any good. So it's not good for that particular task, perhaps. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But there's more nuance that could have been in that. And so then practitioners using it. So there are these people who, I'm doing a diversity training and you're going to do this IAT. One, there's the problem we talked about before where some people are just going to get pissed off. They're not going to want to hear. They're like, oh, this is tricking me. So that's the reason not to do it. And then you're going to have people who pull up this article and they're like, see, this is bullcrap. And so even as participants, or not come to the training because, these people don't know what they're talking about. Look, this newspaper article says it's total crap. And so we talked about how some people have that visceral reaction like, oh, I recognize this bias within myself and I'm going to work on it. Those are the people who are probably already going to be trying to work on these issues. All the people that get turned off by the IAT, either because they find some of these articles or they just have this, oh, you're tricking me to be racist. It shuts them down. It makes them less likely to want to work on these things. And so I think I already said spoiler alert about this. I advise generally kind of not using it as a teaching tool in that way anymore because you just need so much context.
Well, and again, often when and again, I've taken the IET several times, some for coursework, some for my own interest, some for specifically for diversity trainings, and often it is not given any kind of framing of why you're taking this or what you're supposed to get out of it or anything. So like just to be using it, throwing it out willy-nilly without any kind of context or framing of why or how we're going to talk about these results or what this means is irresponsible.
Yeah, irresponsible, and it requires a lot of context.
Yeah.
So then when you're thinking about how much time do you have people's attention,
right.
how much attention you have to give to explaining it and answering people's complaints or criticisms,
right.
which are maybe in many cases valid. Actually,
sure.
and worth talking about, it ends up not being a worthwhile task in terms of the time spent on. And again, I'm not insulting the researchers who use this in well thought out, good research and studies. I have used it in much of my research, and I stand by those research studies. I have a pretty deep understanding of how it works and when it can be useful. But those are people who are coming to a research study. Yep. So they know, like if you're coming to a psychology research study, most of the time, you know, I'm probably going to respond to flashing pictures on a computer screen. Like it's part of the schema. Yeah. But when it's for a work thing and it's like, oh, HR is trying to tell me I'm racist.
Right.
Right. And I've just seen it so many times. Yep. Also, so these meta-analyses that I was talking about, they're saying this one measure, this IAT, it's an indication of kind of your unconscious, something is going on in your unconscious. They're saying that's what should predict behavior by itself.
By itself, yeah.
And that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
There is no one thing that predicts all your behavior.
Right.
You know, your unconscious doesn't control all your behavior.
Exactly.
Like things are implicitly activated or automatically activated. Our behavior isn't all determined by that kind of stuff. It can influence us, but it also interacts with other things. And so even the two meta-analyses I was talking about that were debating, oh, the IAT is a good predictor of behavior or it's not a good predictor of behavior. This is my dissertation from which I finished in 2015, so it's also old now. But I was like, this just completely misses the point.
Right.
You're arguing about a single predictor of behavior. Human behavior isn't predicted by a single thing.
Right.
If there's something you want to buy, for instance, does a different kind of human behavior, you know, well, your interest in the product will be one predictor, how much money you have, whether your friends have it and you want to fit in with them, you know, whether you're trying to save money, other concerns, like there are all these things that interact to determine whether you're going to buy something or not. It's not just going to be your implicit attitude, like automatically, ooh, I like this thing. Right. You know, there are situations where that's more true. If you're drunk and shopping on Amazon, you know, then maybe your unconscious or automatic reactions might be more inclined to do it. Right. But yeah, so our behaviors aren't just determined by this like unconscious outside of awareness stuff. And so this is what I said in my dissertation, that these automatic things, we should look at them in interaction with the conscious values. So that's gets back to Trisha's original study where both people who are very racist and very anti-racist, you see the same automatic patterns of automatic reactions. Right. But the people who are anti-racist, so especially in the modern day where the idea of implicit bias or automatic bias has kind of been out there in culture, people whose conscious values say that bias is wrong, racism is wrong, racial bias is wrong, they regulate their responses. They become more aware. The stuff that we teach in the skills every week or every month, excuse me. And so like those conscious values should interact with the unconscious stuff to predict people's behavior. Right. This is what my entire dissertation was about. Right. And it was the evidence supported this basic idea. Yeah. So if you're looking at these meta-analyses that say, oh, IAT is a single predictor of behavior, oh, it doesn't work very well. Right. You know, you kind of have one takeaway message. But if you start looking at the IAT interacting with people's conscious values, also societal, social pressures that people might be sensitive to, then you see that in conjunction with those things, it actually is a bit better at predicting behavior because someone whose conscious values say bias is wrong, when something comes to mind, they try to regulate it. Right. For someone who is in favor of bias, so someone who's more racist, essentially, the unconscious or the automatic things are in line with what their values say. Right. So if it's disliking a black person, well, their conscious values also say they should dislike a black person. Right. So then we see that behavior. The implicit measure, the IAT measure, does predict for them and then doesn't predict for someone who's more conscious about these things.
Right. Well, it's really interesting and it makes a lot of sense. I do think, and we mentioned earlier that sometimes we still make decisions or we're still having behaviors that are in misalignment, right, with our values or that are more in alignment with these kind of maybe unconscious biases or that there are structures and systems in place that push us. Like I talked about this last season in the health the bias in healthcare, right? That there are some things and sometimes where even regardless of our values, we're still acting in ways because of the systems in place or things that are in place that still that make us have behaviors that misalign with our values. So it happens both and. But that I think that makes a lot of sense though, right? Like if we have these conscious values and we have like we were talking off camera earlier about the like intrusive thoughts, right? Yeah. Like we can't.
Sometimes you let the intrusive thoughts win.
Sometimes the intrusive thoughts win, or sometimes they take over. That's like the thing that comes in. But also our conscious awareness, our conscious values, the things that we really care about, often will kind of play interference, right? And there are times, there are situations, there are systems, there are things that make our ability to allow that consciousness and the slowing down and making
regulation,
right, intentional decisions that are in alignment. Like from a clinical standpoint, we use ACT. So acceptance and commitment therapy is all about making decisions, not allowing our unconscious things or the intrusive thoughts to run us, but to make decisions that are in alignment with our values, right? And the whole reason we have that is because there are times that the intrusive thoughts wins or the situation wins over what we actually truly value. And how do we slow down enough to make sure that we're allowing that to happen?
Exactly. And so I want to, just say to everyone, your unconscious mind or automatically activated thoughts, they don't control all your behavior. Right. They influence. Yep. Sometimes the intrusive thoughts win, to use that phrasing. And so this idea of the IAT, which is itself is a limited measure. Mm-hmm. I think it's overall a pretty good measure of what it's actually measuring. It's not even a measurement of all the unconscious kind of stuff that might influence behavior. But no one measure, no one thing is going to predict behavior completely on its own.
Absolutely.
And in this literature, both the kind of cognitive scientists and scientific psychologists like myself, there are a lot of studies where the IAT is basically their operationalization of race bias. So rather than all the work of having to hire a black actor to be the person sitting in the chair, to use that example I had earlier, and then all of that, that's a lot of work to set up a behavioral study. If you just do a computer task like the IAT, it's easier to run the research. So there are researchers who kind of started becoming all about research on the IAT without doing that behavioral component. Right. And so that became part of this problem. And then these studies that were meta-analyzed. Yeah. And then also people who weren't really very scientific or weren't experts, the IAT is easy to use. So they put out these little kind of cute studies that maybe aren't as rigorous, aren't as theoretical, aren't as well thought through, which has resulted in this mess.
Right. Interesting.
And when these meta-analyses came out, one of the things people started saying is, implicit bias isn't a problem. And so this whole literature, because this meta-analysis says it doesn't predict behavior very well as a single predictor, which I take issue with, it's not a problem. Right. And here
that's not accurate either.
There are a few particular researchers I have in mind, and I'm not going to call them out because it's not about that. But they just really push that message, and I'm like, can we be thoughtful about? You can. I actually agree with the meta-analysis that says the IAT isn't a very good predictor of this kind of racial bias behavior. I'm on board because my dissertation said, you need to interact it with other things. But then throwing out the whole idea that implicit bias is a problem
is not a thing.
Is ridiculous. Right. I'm sorry. It is absolutely idiotic. From a few fronts.
Right. Like we have to have more nuance. And I think that's one of the things, again, from a clinical standpoint, we also from DBT, we have to be able to hold the dialectic, right? Like and that's why
two contradicting thoughts.
Contradicting thoughts at the same time, which is why I often say both and I say and rather than but, because you have to be able to hold the more than one thing. We can be more than one thing. That's also why I love Inside Out and Inside Out too, because they talk a lot about that, right? Like we can be more than one thing, and the IAT is more than one thing. And
people's behavior is more than just their unconscious intrusive thoughts winning, but also we shouldn't completely discard them.
Exactly.
So, and one thing I say to these researchers, if any of them are listening, is, you know what, like, okay, we can talk about the IAT and this computerized thing and this meta-analysis, which again, I'm not dissing the meta-analysis. I think it's basically correct. And it's just, we need to think more broadly about how we predict human behavior.
Right.
But the people who are like, oh, implicit bias isn't a problem.
Right.
How about we listen to Black people?
Right.
I'm sorry. Black people all the time say that these kind of unintentional things happen to them. And in fact, there's a really great study. It is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. It's a couple years old now, but really strong findings. So this is a very representative research study of Black Americans. So they have a very high sample size, really good sampling. And they asked them kind of what are some of the major barriers in their lives related to race, these Black folks. And unconscious bias. So 7 out of 10 say that unconscious racial bias has been an obstacle in their lives. And that's a higher number than the Black folks who said that structural racism was a problem. Right. Yeah. So we often talk about kind of structural issues of being so far reaching. And so they seep into every aspect of our lives and work against Black folks. But what the Black people are saying is actually, no, it's white people's unconscious racial bias. Yeah, that's what they see every single day. They experience every single day.
And we talked about the cumulative effects.
The cumulative effects of it.
That's really, I think,
the
racial battle fatigue, which we talked about last episode. It's the cumulative effects of these things. Like it's like, overt racism. I'm like, all right, well, I can discount that, right? Like I know that you're a racist jerk. You're not gonna like me. Like I can accept that, but it's the people that I trust, that I let in, that I have those things, that then those unconscious things or unintentional things happen.
And then it's like, am I being too sensitive?
Right.
Or like, did they really mean it the way that kind of sounded? Like, am I overthinking it?
And then the emotional labor that I have just trying to parse out what that means and how do I respond to it and how do I react to it? Do I say something? Like the amount of that and the cumulative effect of those things happening over time, even throughout just the one day, is way more impactful than somebody who I know I can discount because I know that they're not going to respect me or value me. It takes a lot more. Yeah. It takes a lot more energy than those things that are much more structural or overt.
Yeah. And I mean, this isn't the most scientific way to say this, but I'm just going to repeat. How dare you? Like to the people who are saying, oh, this isn't a problem. How dare you? Like listen to people. I am a scientist. I love data. Right. I believe in evidence. Yes. And this is a little more qualitative, more survey kind of data, but we're talking about real people's lives and you're making claims that then potentially affect real people's lives. Because if there's someone who kind of thinks, oh, implicit bias is kind of a problem, like, and maybe they're a little conscious of it and maybe doing some of that regulation we were talking about because they think it seems like a good idea. And then they hear some scientist who's like, implicit bias isn't a problem. Well, then they give up on all their work or potentially they will if they're really taking that seriously. Yeah. And I've been talking about, listening to Black people, but also listen to white people because Trish Devine, my advisor, who I think at this point, by this time this episode is out, will be recently retired or soon. She's close to that. She's had a very wonderful career and deserves her retirement. Yes. She's done a lot of wonderful work in this area. But throughout the 30 plus years of her career, she has again and again and again documented that white folks, they say, I express bias and I wish I didn't. Yeah. Like this happened and I'm so sorry. Yeah. I wish I could be better. Oh, can I work at this? I do things unintentionally. Right. And wish I were better. And again, as we said before, not just with race, with gender, with other racial groups, sexual orientation, disability, age bias, all of these things. And so these people who are, I think, very incorrectly pushing this, implicit bias isn't a problem because of certain data, and then also ignoring a lot of other data. I think you're doing harm, and I think you're very misguided.
Disservice, 100%.
You need to learn the breadth of the literature. This is something I would always say to my students and young grad students. Like, you need to know the literature before you can start making willy-nilly claims. This is part of why the peer review process is so important. I've definitely been a peer reviewer on some of these kinds of studies where I'm like, no, you don't like the IAT, or you don't like thinking about this, so you're kind of throwing out a baby with the bathwater.
Absolutely.
The real struggles people have on day-to-day life, they say these things are a problem. And yes, they interact with these kind of other psychological factors, as is the case with every behavior.
Right.
So there's this controversy around implicit bias in the IAT. There's some people who love it. There's some people who hate it. And I don't want the notion of unintentional bias and the personal dilemma of unintentional bias to get lost. Because of some computer task that people do.
Right.
And actually, Trish and I wrote a book chapter on this that came out late last year. And actually, I'll make a note. We'll have a link to that. You can check it out if you want to read more on the kind of scientific unpacking of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's really great. So, I don't know. I hope it's okay if I have a question, like moving to our question, unless there was more that you.
Nope. That's what I had for the main topic. But you want to hit me with the question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because as you were talking and everything that was coming up, and there are multiple words that came up. And one of the things that I know that you use a lot, which I really love and have adopted it myself and have encouraged my students to adopt as well, is talking about unintentional bias. But also a lot of what you talked about was implicit bias and unconscious bias. And are there differences? What is the difference between unintentional versus unconscious versus implicit? And where does that all fit together?
So for our purposes, yours and mine on this podcast, and for our listeners, they're all essentially the same thing. So in the literature, I think the term implicit bias is preferred. So when you're talking about measures like the IAT, things that are kind of reaction time, fast stuff on a computer, those are called implicit measures. Other terms like unconscious, that's about how aware of something you are. And, part of sometimes when you use unconscious, let's say, well, people are like, oh, well, I can't be aware of it, so we're, but it's not that you can't be, it's that sometimes it operates without you being aware of it. So there are all these different kinds of terms. And for some scientific purposes and scientific papers, it might be very important to distinguish between them. But for practical purposes, and that's in our tagline, right? Science, practical skills, and joy are what we're about. Unintentional bias is the best. In my opinion, and in Trisha's opinion, we kind of came up with that together because the point is your intentions are positive, your intentions are to be fair, but sometimes something automatic comes in that's unintentional. Right. And that best characterizes this kind of personal dilemma that people have where, oh, crap, I just slipped up and said something biased or lacking inclusion or racist or whatever the things are. It violates your intentions. I didn't mean to do that. It's unintentional. Yeah.
Well, and again, I think that gets at the, unconscious kind of gets at the awareness piece of it. The implicit kind of gets at this research reaction time. And the unintentional, to me, gets at the behavior, right? Exactly. And that's really what we're talking about, that practical piece. Not everybody's going to be out here doing research, right? And we're speaking to everybody every day in our everyday interactions. And that is this behavioral part of it, which is doing things that are unintentional, even if I have the best intentions at heart, but I will still behave or do something that's unintentional.
And then, when I was talking about the kind of interaction of multiple predictors to predict behavior, so it's not just the unconscious, it's also your regulation and so on. Unintentional kind of gets at that too, because it also says what your intentions might have been or kind of implies them. Oh, this is something that is in violation of these other things. And this is a common thing that I think a lot of people in diversity spaces use the analogy of stepping on someone's foot. So if I step on your foot, it was probably unintentional.
Right.
But I still should apologize for it and so on.
Yeah.
But if I hate you or something and I step on your foot, it might have been, I might not have meant to, but then I'm kind of happy with the result. So unintentional bias is what I prefer. It's what we mostly use on this podcast. What I encourage all of you to use, because labeling something as unintentional also brings with it, well, what were the intentions? And then how do we bring the intentions into play to the forefront next time or now to correct our mistake? Right.
And again, it goes back to that aligning your behavior with your values, right? So if it was unintentional, what were my intentions?
Correct.
Can I bring my intentions to the forefront, and how do I adjust to make sure that my behavior is in alignment with my intentions, my values?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yes. So hopefully that makes sense for folks. Again, Trish and I wrote this book chapter where we unpack this very specifically that I can link to a PDF of that in the episode description.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So skills next, or actually we probably need a little break. Let's take a little break and we'll be right back, folks.
Awesome. So, after talking through our questions, let's move to our skill. What is our habit breaking skill for the day?
We're going a little out of order because the story I have kind of follows from the skill. So I was thinking about which skill to bring in today. And, we're talking about this implicit bias in adults after it's kind of already in people's minds. But I want to kind of back up and be like, where does bias come from? Like, why do we have that stuff in our minds in the first place? And so to frame that more specifically as a skill and kind of jumping ahead a little, the skill is to be mindful of your input. Research shows that kids as young as 4, 5, and 6 years old already know predominant stereotypes about different social groups. Now, kids that young, they don't have the word stereotype in their lexicon, in their vocabulary, but they'll say things like, oh, black people are like this, and Asian people are like that, and white people are like this. Men are supposed to be this way, women are supposed to be that way. And they learn these things from their social environments and especially from the media.
Of course, yeah.
So there are lots of media examples I use from this when I am giving the training, but to make it audio friendly, I'll just focus on one or two. There are 2 newspaper clippings from Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. And I want you listeners to kind of imagine them. So one of them has a picture of a young black man, and the other one has a picture of some white folks. And the captions of these newspaper clippings are nearly identical. The caption...
before you go into the caption, what is the picture of?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
This was during Hurricane Katrina. So there's flood waters. There's a picture of a young black man kind of carrying wading through the waters, carrying some things. And same thing for the white folks. They're in some flood waters carrying some things. Again, the pictures are also nearly identical. People surviving in a hurricane, horrible disaster of Hurricane Katrina many years back. And then the captions describing these pictures are nearly identical because, again, they're very similar pictures. But the picture of the young black man, his caption reads, "A young man wades through chest-deep water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans." The caption for the 2 white folks, again, almost the same sentence. 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda at a local grocery store. So now... finding versus looting. Now, the white folks, if they found stuff at a grocery store and then took it, that's also looting.
It's also looting,
but it didn't get characterized that way. And this is a pattern that we see. This reflects a deeper research background. It's not just like some example I found that I thought was cute. And I didn't originally find that one. I should give credit where credit's due. But this reflects a deeper research literature. Our colleagues in communication sciences do these research studies where they get thousands of newspaper clippings like that or thousands of nightly news programs and look at the patterns. And very, 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 very often, if it's a black or a brown person who's engaging in whatever kind of behavior, a behavior that could be called looting or it could be called finding, if it's a black or a brown person, they get the looting. They get the more criminal kind of wording. If it's a white person, much less often that criminal wording. And what this ends up doing is it programs into our minds this idea that black and brown folks are criminal or dangerous, much more so than white folks. And, what gets programmed into our minds, our automatic responses, our unconscious, to use some of the terms we were using earlier, it's the input we get. Right. It's not necessarily reality. Right. So if we were just walking throughout the world and there were no media and we were just truly objectively, meeting black people and white people, you wouldn't have these kinds of patterns. But because these things get filtered through the media and through the biases of the people in the media who are making decisions, not even necessarily intentionally, although it could be intentional sometimes, and in long ago history definitely was, we get a pattern in our minds that reflects the pattern in the media and our social environment that says black people are criminal. Right. And this actually, in this particular kind of example about crime, it's actually the exact opposite of what real crime statistics in the US say. Right. So if we go for just national crime statistics, you the listener, if we were going by national statistics, if you happen to be the victim of a violent crime, it's actually more than twice as likely that the person committing that crime would be a white person because there are more white people than black people in the United States. And so when we're looking at violent crimes, more of them are committed by white people. However, when you're looking at news media coverage of crime, it's actually much more likely that you see black people committing crimes. And there are a number of reasons for this. One, if it's a white person who's committing a crime, it's much less likely that the media even reports on it at all. When they're deciding what's going on in the news and what's not, they think it's not as interesting of a story or what have you. They don't even report the violent crimes by white folks. Or if they do report on it, they're actually much less likely to show a picture. Yeah. So they're more likely to show a picture if it's a black person. So sometimes you see crime reporting and it's just, you hear about the crime, but you don't see who it is. But when it's a black person who's committed the crime, you see them. And so you have that mental association with the crime. Kids pick up on this. Adults, we keep getting this stuff, and it builds these biases, these stereotypes, these habits of mind. Again, this whole notion of bias being like a habit, this unintentional bias being like a habit. Absolutely.
Well, and it goes to, and I don't know all the statistics, so we can double check them, but also the overrepresent, again, having the bias, and then the behavior that follows, which then we also see it replicated in the overrepresentation of black and brown folks that are incarcerated, right? Yes. So even though the likelihood that the person folks that are committing crimes is more likely to be white, we actually see a much higher rate of black and brown folks who are incarcerated, right? Right. Yep.
Yeah. And that's, think of biases at each stage of that. So who the cops actually charge, who then goes on to be convicted and what kind of sentencing. Right. But actually the crime statistics are from the FBI reporting arrests and convictions. That's amazing, yeah. And so it's still there's still more white people. Yep. But it's that any given black person has a higher likelihood of being convicted. Yeah. Yep. Interesting. What else? I have lots of examples of this. So those are race examples. So we learn these things from our social environments, from the media, and I actually have I want to get into story time next, because some of the stories kind of showcase this. So I give this training all over the world, and hear people's stories, and one person shared this. So this is a white man, and he was talking about his young kid who I think was about 4 or 5 at the time. They were at a doctor's appointment. They lived in a predominantly white neighborhood. And so he's in a white family. So the kid mostly sees white people in his life. But at this doctor's appointment in the waiting room, there was a black family that came in. And his little 4 or 5-year-old boy looks at them, points at them, and starts singing the theme song to the TV show Cops. So, the bad boys, what you gonna do? Imagine a little kid pointing at a black family singing this. And of course, the father mortified, didn't teach his son to do that or anything. Right. But what he put together, and then when we were talking about media teaching kids things, he was like, sometimes the TV show Cops is on in our house. And that's the only time he sees black people. Right. And so think about how powerful that is. Right. The only time you see a black person is the TV show Cops, which is already going to be there's involved in some kind of crime. Absolutely. And that's and there's this primacy effect in kids learning. Yep. The first thing they learn is going to be very powerful about a given category. And everything else starts getting learned through the lens of that initial idea.
Well, and it also reminds me of like the Clark and Clark's doll study, right? We saw something very similar. The doll study really was taking these elementary young kids and giving them a choice, black and white kids and everything in between, a choice between a white doll and a black doll, and then naming and saying like, why did you choose this? And most of the children chose the white doll, and then they would say that the black doll was bad,
including the black children.
And
that research study was used, I want to say with Brown versus the Board of Education. Yeah, so that was the Supreme Court ruling that eliminated desegregation. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, great black psychologists.
Yes.
I mentioned Trish a few times. Trish Devine, my PhD advisor and dear friend. You know, when you become an established professor and you start getting, you know, accolades, you pick a name, like an honorific, usually named after, like someone is the so-and-so professor of psychology. Trish is the Kenneth and Mamie Clark professor of psychology. She chose to honor them as her honorific. Yeah. Awesome. Also very important study.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's again, that being mindful of your input, right? And like recognizing
back to the skill, being mindful of the input.
And that this kiddo, while not even recognizing his father, not even recognizing like, oh my gosh, some of the only exposures that my child is having are some of these really negative portrayals of Black folks.
Yeah. And not just for kids, but definitely for kids, but also for us as adults. You know, we talked about things like confirmation bias, where whenever we see an example of a Black person who's a criminal, your brain weighs that more heavily in memory. And it is more likely to influence you than each time you see a Black person who's not a criminal. And there are a number of reasons for that. But the things that kind of confirm the pre-existing unconscious ideas hold more weight for us. So one way to do this, kind of being mindful of your input, when you see a representation like that, it's not like we just avoid everything. And it's not, one, you can't, it's not possible. And two, you know, there are shows that portray Black people as criminals, but do it in a more nuanced way, but from Black creators, thinking of like the both fans. Like we want to fight stereotypes, but also we can't deny that there are any Black people who commit crimes. You know, so figuring out how to do that in a nuanced way. But you can think through like, oh gosh, this is portraying a Black person as a criminal. I know not all Black people are criminals. Like working on like, what are the other thoughts, the contradicting thoughts that you can bring in to try to give that less space in your mind. And it's, I have one more story that I want to toss in. You know, some people in reaction to the cops story I shared, they're like, well, that's a bad parent letting their kids see that. And I don't judge him in that way, but I can see where if you're trying to curate the media diet that your kids have, that might be something to avoid. Any portrayal of kind of crime or scary things like that. But also, even if you only let your kid watch shows that are made by researchers, there are a lot of great kid shows that I believe think very carefully about representation. You can't control everything. And the commercials, even if it's Sesame Street or something, which I think Sesame Street, they work with researchers. They do a lot of good work. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's pretty dang good as far as kids programming. Even if it's Sesame Street, there might be commercials depending on how you're watching it. And the kids commercials out there, I mean, it's girls like girly things and boys like boy things because they're trying to push something. And so you can't control everything. And even if you did, well, even if you tried to, you couldn't.
Attempted.
There are two gender researchers, kind of famous gender researchers, and they wanted to bring up their kids in a perfectly gender equitable environment. They didn't let any outside books in, or they would alter the books. So if there's a male doctor, there's also a female doctor. If there's a female nurse, there's also a male nurse. Perfect gender equity, equality in everything their kids saw. Really controlled it. But you know, then what happens? The kids go to kindergarten, and all the other kids
encounter the world.
They encounter the real world. Exactly. And other kids are like, no, girls are like this and boys are like that. And so even the children that had this kind of perfectly curated thing, you know, you get out in the real world. And this is also brings us back to the implicit bias, unintentional bias kind of thing. You know, even if I could go into your brain and erase the bias, well, as soon as you walk out of my laboratory, you're going to be back in the world. These messages are going to be there. You're going to reabsorb them. That's why we need to rely on these conscious skills. We
Right.
need to develop skills to address these things.
Absolutely.
And, whenever we're talking about skills, if someone's listening to all these episodes, sometimes it sounds like a lot of work. It's like, oh, this skill and that skill and this problem and that problem, which is also why we infuse joy into
Right.
things overall. But although it can be hard work and sometimes it's needed hard work, part of the point is as you develop a skill, you get better.
Mm-hmm.
It gets easier over time as you practice these things. It's not like, oh, all the time I just have to be working at this every second of the day. It's so tiring. It's such a burden. It's not that. It's become conscious of these things, and you can start learning better ways to be, and it gets easier and easier and easier.
Absolutely.
Once we work on these practical skills that really work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And I think that taking the time, thinking clinically, right, of focusing on one skill at a time, one thing at a time, and then practicing and calling it out, which is part of my story, right? So like my
great. Yeah. The more positive story.
The more positive
getting
story
into.
and the practicing, right? And it's related to the kind of you guys example that we've used several times in previous episodes. But I have few years ago, or when I was staff at a hospital, and I had some trainees, interns. And I was really just trying to be very intentional about remembering everybody's name and learning everyone's name. And I had the list, and I was just trying to like attach, like, oh, you're Matt, you're this person, right? And we had one Latinx student, and I was looking at the list of names, and there was one name that was more ethnic sounding, right? Or looked hard to pronounce for
looked
you. Hard to pronounce for me. And I look at my one brown trainee, and I go, how do you pronounce your name again? And she goes, Sandy? And I'm like, oh no. And I said, okay.
Sorry to laugh.
And I said, I am so sorry. Let me just call this out right now. I saw this name on here. It looked hard to pronounce. It looked ethnic sounding. And I assumed that it was you. And I really apologize. And this name happened to be attached. It's Greek. And it went to the blonde hair, blue-eyed person that was there that I wouldn't have attached that name to. And so, but calling that out, right? Like calling out, and addressing it. I was proud of myself for just calling it out and apologizing in the moment, right? And even saying exactly what happened rather than trying to pretend or try to brush it under the rug. Because I think that also happens a lot, right? Like I'm not going to call out my mistake. I'm just going to pretend it didn't happen. Or
people are afraid of drawing more attention to it.
Right.
But the fact is, everyone was there. They noticed.
Right.
And this is something in my research studies, my colleagues' research studies. People will learn from your example. Exactly. Because I assume that student kind of forgave you and wasn't like, they're like, oh yeah, you kind of made an assumption, but like they let you off the hook. I assume you had a good relationship after, because all your students love you. But the point is, everyone sees like, oh, it actually it feels good to address something and apologize and to kind of heal from some, even if it's a seemingly small harm, but also we can think about the accumulation of those things over time, like we talked about in a previous episode. But you set an example, and then other people are like, that doesn't look so hard to be like, oh my gosh, I made an assumption, I apologize. That's not, that's not how I want to do things. And and it is. So thank you for sharing that positive stuff.
Absolutely. And I do think that like in the moment it was helpful, but it's also been really helpful to use as an example of like, just because I'm Black, or just because I'm a person of color, or just because I'm somebody who does diversity, right? And like teaches diversity, doesn't mean I'm immune to making mistakes or that these biases and these things aren't going to come out, or assumptions aren't going to come out in some way. That we all have these areas to continue to work on and to be mindful of and addressing in our everyday life.
Or like, it reminds me of that example from last month's episode with Bernie, and like that person who said to him, just so you know, I'm a diversity expert.
Right.
Like, well, no, like, come on.
Even if you are a quote unquote expert, like we all have times, and we all have to continue to be mindful of it.
All right. Thank you for sharing your story. And as always, the second piece of bread on our Diverse Joy sandwich is some kind of joyful recommendation. And you've got one for us today.
Yeah. So it is not related to our topic today necessarily at all, but again, if you're playing a Diverse Joy bingo, my recommendation is drag related, and one of probably my favorite drag queen outside of RuPaul, who's like mother, right? She's queen,
the
queen mother of them all. But Trixie Motel is one of my favorite drag queens, and she has a show. I think it's on Max, HBO Max, and it's called Trixie Motel. And there's 2 seasons of it. And the first season, she buys a motel in Palm Springs, and it is this beautiful mix of like her drag and her friends, and also like a home makeover show. And she talks about how like she's essentially putting this motel in it is in drag, essentially, is what she says. So watching her redo this motel that she found and making it Trixie, and each room is very stylized and specific and has different themes. And then the second season, she and her partner buy a home in LA. And so they then go through and put their house and like make their home together. Aww. And you watch them, and it's really cool. Oh, so it's also on Discovery Plus. And so it's just really cool to see, watch her style come out, and as Brian is Trixie's like real name, his name.
I was gonna ask. So when you said Trixie's partner, you meant Trixie's other persona's partner.
Yeah, right? Brian's partner. But they do a lot with Trixie and drag, but Brian really being able to work with his partner and them creating a home together that is for Brian and not Trixie, right? Yeah. Like actually leaving Trixie at his condo, and like that's Trixie's place, and this home is my home. But this the infusion of their personalities, and again, it's a home makeover show, so it's just really, really fun, and it's got a little bit of drag, and Orville Peck comes in, and Nicole Byer comes in, and Nicole Byer. All these other kind of guests and stuff. Brittany Bronsky. She's a social media person. Anyway, it's great. It's a lot of fun. It's super quirky. It's also, I mentioned my 40 before 40. Going and staying at the Trixie Motel in Palm Springs is on my 40 before 40.
Ooh, so, like not to like shove in on your thing, but like, could we make it a Diverse Joy on-site trip?
Yeah, I was like, it might have to be like a day that I go to Disney, and I'm gonna go down and stay a day down there. And so, Brittany Broski. Sorry, I said Bronsky. Brittany Broski. But yeah, so it's on my list of things I'd like to do before my next birthday. So we might have some pictures of that coming soon. Woo. Anyway, that is my joyful recommendation. So check it out on Discovery Plus or Max.
Nice. All right. Well, with that, I'm Dr. William Cox.
I'm Dr. Amber Nelson.
Diverse Joy is produced by Eric Roman Binding with music by Jay Arner. It is accessible as a video podcast on YouTube or an audio-only podcast wherever you get podcasts, or at diversejoy.com. You can also follow us at Diverse Joy on most social media platforms. If you enjoy the show, help us reach more people by leaving 5-star reviews in your podcasting app, or recommending it personally. Word of mouth is the #1 way that podcasts reach new people. So please put it out there. Also, Diverse Joy is the official podcast of Inequity Agents of Change, a nonprofit devoted to evidence-based approaches to reduce bias, create inclusion, and promote equity. All that good Jedi work. Learn more at biashabit.com. Thank you for joining us. Now, go find your joy. Bye. Bye. For sharing and talking with me through this episode. Mm-hmm. Great job, both of us. Rowan, cut that. I don't know what I was just saying. That's stupid.